Daniel, are you ready for us to pick on them?
Yeah.
That's the last of the drama.
Yeah.
Welcome. Hello, everyone. We're glad that you're able to join us today for a talk from Dr. Dubois on online harassment of journalists and health communicators. This event is hosted by the Center for Information Technology and Public Life here at the University of North Carolina as part of our spring speaker series. I'm Catherine Peters, CTAP's Executive Director. For those of you who are here in person, please feel free to grab, there's some light snacks and beverages from books at the back of the room, by all means. CTAP dedicated to understanding the growing impact of the internet, social media, and other forms of digital institution in the context of people design, use, and govern them. We're especially interested in people, platforms, and power. Our research takes a holistic approach to studying, focusing on how social inequality and power structures shape the use, deployment, and impact of these technologies. We are committed to equality and justice in our scholarship and defense. In that spirit, I'd like for us to take a moment today to consider the legacy of colonization in our technology system and society. Our center occupies the ancestral land of many Native peoples, including the Shakori, Kino, Tuscarora, and Lumbee, and remains home today to the Occaneechi Band of Sequanian Nation. The university was funded in its early years from the sale of lands home to the Cherokee and Chickasaw Nation. I invite you to join us in acknowledging the shared responsibility that we have to reconciliation and justice. Today, we're honored to be hosting Dr. Dubois. After this talk, we'll be holding a Q&A session. For those of you who are joining us remotely, you can submit questions via email, ctap@unc.edu. That is CITAP@unc.edu. To introduce our speaker, I'll turn the microphone over to my colleague, Dr. Daniel Kreis, a principal investigator here at CTAP and a professor here in the Hudson School of Journalism.
Thanks everyone for coming out to our opening event for the spring semester. It's wonderful to see so many faces in the room. Just a reminder, we have epilogue in the back, so go get yourself some really good snacks and drinks. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Dubois, who is an associate professor in the Department of Communication and the University Research Chair in Politics, Communication, and Technology at the University of Ottawa. She also runs the Political Tech Lab and a member of the Center for Law, Technology, and Society at the University of Ottawa. She is a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University and one of our very own affiliates here at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life. We're also really fortunate to have Elizabeth be in residence with us for the next month here. So I encourage you all after Elizabeth's talk to go and connect, grab coffee, grab a drink, and learn from an amazing scholar. Let me just say just a few quick words, because I've known Elizabeth for almost a decade now. Elizabeth was really one of the first generation of researchers studying the impact of digital technologies on electoral institutions, political campaigning in Canada and in the US, as well as joining other international collaborative teams. I've always been really impressed by the breadth of Elizabeth's scholarship. She has studied campaigns, campaign practitioners, the uptake of new digital tactics. She's done early research on things like computational propaganda and journalistic trust. She studied AI systems and what that means for verification, for authenticity, for the quality of political discourse. And I think throughout it all, her many empirical contributions, Elizabeth has been really deeply grounded in a set of normative values about democracy and quality discourse and equality. So with that, it's truly my honor to welcome Elizabeth, who we'll be hearing from for the next hour or so. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much. It is so wonderful to be here. I'm gonna grab the clicker. Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. Daniel and I actually met at the very first academic conference I went to. My supervisor sent me in his place, not really realizing what he was throwing me into. But Daniel and a number of other colleagues were really welcoming and wonderful, and it has set me on a good path. So today I want to talk about when hate and harassment are just part of the job. Particularly, I look at political journalists and public health communicators, but there's some work on political candidates that I'll draw into this as well. So we've already kind of gone over who I am. The other thing that I'll just add is I have a podcast called Wonks and War Rooms, where I present political communication theories to political practitioners, and we talk about when it makes sense and when it doesn't make sense in their lived experiences. So if you're a podcast person, you can find me wherever you get your podcast. So technical difficulties.
How's that?
All right, so this project, which I've been working on for about 6 years, started when I got this tweet from somebody who's really mean. I had been on a news program, not like a big, well-known news program, like a tiny one in England at like midnight, and got a bunch of people asking me, to be friends on Facebook. And I tweeted, I was like, hey, anyone else get random dudes trying to friend them on Facebook after public appearances? That's weird. And then I got this response, which didn't make me very happy, but I knew not to feed the trolls, so I didn't respond. And instead I created a 6-year research project. So this led to me to thinking about like, okay, if I, assistant professor, not super well known, am getting hate like that for a tiny little insignificant appearance, what are journalists getting? What are politicians getting? What are other public figures getting? And we know that it's a lot. In the past 12 months, the majority of journalists in both the US and Canada have received some sort of online harassment. The number is almost as high for public health communicators, although our data is just not really as strong, so I don't report the stats on that because we're still working on that as a public, you know? And so I think the big things here that we need to think about are how much is happening and what kind of that meanness is happening. Because we know that people are reporting it. Yeah, in the last 12 months, I've had some online harassment, but that doesn't really help us develop good policy responses. It doesn't really help us develop good journalistic codes of ethics or journalistic responses. It doesn't help us or tech companies create good responses to minimize harms on their platforms. We need more detail to be able to do those things well. So the research questions that have guided this project for the 6 years have been about quantity and the quality. And I want to really emphasize quality here because a lot of studies default to quantity only. How frequent is the meanness? How frequent do we see incivility? How frequently do we see hate speech? Those kinds of things. And the problem is, the internet is a space where you can very quickly send a lot of the same stuff over and over and over again. And also, the qualities are the things that make something really emotionally difficult to manage or something you can ignore. Really difficult for you to justify continuing being online, doing your job online versus being able to ignore it, right? Like the qualities are the things that make people change their minds about how they're going to act online. And so for journalists and public health communicators, when they have very little choices about where they get to do their job, we need to think about what they're getting, even if it comes in small quantity. And then the last thing here, which is not a formal research question, but something I care about a lot in all of my projects is, are our methods good enough and can we make them better? So there are 4 different research projects that I do in collaboration with a number of others. This is just the quick summary here. So we've got the Mean Tweets Project, which is the original one. It looks at political journalists during the 2019 federal election in Canada. All of the tweets that were mentioning them during a 3-month period leading up to that campaign, or leading up to election day rather, through that campaign, we collected, and then we interviewed a bunch of people before and after the election about their experiences of dealing with online negativity. I do that project with Chris Tunov, who is a postdoctoral researcher at UBC. Then there's the harassment of public health officials during COVID in Canada. And I did this work in collaboration with Michelle Hennessy, who is a master's graduate from UAuto's communication department. Then we have a newer project mobilizing a network of health communicators to try and investigate and respond to online abuse. And this is in the early stages. Dr. Heidi Tworik at UBC is the leader on this project, and we're trying to work to create a community of practice doing action-oriented practice-based research to try and understand the lived experiences, to try and develop better responses. And finally, Shooting the Messenger is a project that I am a collaborator on. The main output so far on that one has been a global survey of journalists to understand what kinds of credibility and other negativity attacks they're receiving online. So, by the end of this, hopefully, I will convince you that online harassment affects people's ability to do their job. You're here, so probably you already think that a little bit. Thank you. Second is I'm going to try and argue that intensity and type of negativity help us understand differences based on identity. Because in the research right now, it's not always easy to actually pick apart how attacks and harassment and hate speech differ depending on personal characteristics like gender or race or sexual orientation, although we know from anecdotal evidence that those things actually do matter quite a lot. And then finally, I'm going to make that argument that we need better methods to understand this. In particular, a more holistic and mixed methods approach is what I like to apply. So, starting off with a little bit of data from the Shooting the Messenger project, we talked to nearly 600 different journalists who cover countries all over the world. They live in countries all over the world, grew up in countries from all over the world, have very different lived experiences. This is a chart that shows people from India, Colombia, and Canada, their responses. I picked those countries because that fits on a graph that goes on a slide much better than all of the countries we looked at. But this shows the general trend of if you're in a country where there is low journalistic freedom, you get more attacks than when you're in a country with high journalistic freedom. That said, not great across the board. Even Canada, which is the red bar on the end, still quite high in terms of the amount of attacks that these journalists receive. And this slide here just shows some credibility attacks, different types of credibility attacks that are out there. I know for those of you in the room, it's a little hard to see. Probably if you're watching the live stream, you can actually read it. But the important thing here is it's the professional attacks and attacks on your ability to do your job that are most common, which we would expect and we would even think is good for democracy, right? We want people to be critical of whether or not journalists are doing their jobs the way they are supposed to, depending on the particular system at play. And there's fewer instances of things like attacks based on race, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, those kinds of things. But what this graph does is that deceiving thing where it makes it seem like we don't really need to be worried because there's so few of them. And the problem is when we get into the open-ended questions in this survey, people talk about those less frequent ones as being much more problematic. They're the ones that make them think maybe I shouldn't continue being a journalist. They're the ones that make them worried about their physical or emotional safety. They're the ones that make people worry about what they're going to get back if they decide to report on one issue versus maybe another. And then here we've got just a graph summarizing some of the impacts of these kinds of credibility attacks. So things like having emotional or physical well-being becoming a problem, considering leaving journalism. There's a variety of other things. And if you're interested in the detailed report, I can share that out with you all later. So this is the quickest lit review you will ever see of the relationship between harassment and hate and identity characteristics. It is not comprehensive, and please do not cite this in any sort of paper, but I needed a quick way of making the point that depending on what methods we're using, we seem to have a very different understanding of whether or not that relationship exists between one's own identity characteristics and the amount and kind of harassment and hate they receive. When we think about anecdotes, journalistic coverage, gray literature, all of it, yeah, there's a relationship for sure. And like, if you're not a white man, you're probably in a bad spot, right? Same thing when we do surveys of actual practitioners, and this is the case for journalists and public health communicators, as well as candidates. Same thing when we do interviews with any of those kinds of practitioners. When we go to the automated content analysis, the large scale studies that are so great at like knowing what's actually happening because it's behavioral data, there's no relationship to be found. Or some people say one group has it, another study has the exact opposite as being more or less than some other group. And so this is confusing in the findings at the very least, and really points to the need for that interdisciplinary and mixed methods approach that I'm going to keep advocating here. Because looking at behavioral data is really helpful. We do want to know what's actually out there, but understanding that behavioral data from the perspective of the people that we're trying to help with the research, that's kind of a crucial piece of this. So, is everyone wrong, or is this just bad measurement? I'm going to argue bad measurement slash just measurement that we can tweak and like make a little bit better. All right, let's get into some of the specific findings from our studies. First off, playing the platform's game. So through primarily interviews, we as a group of researchers have started to kind of hone in on this idea that these public health communicators and journalists and candidates are feeling a lot of pressure to be on particular platforms and to use those platforms in particular ways based on societal expectations, probably based often on economic expectations, what their bosses want. Clicks are really good if you work in an industry where advertising matters. And so what we see is that there are people who feel like the only option is to go where the audiences are. And they go where the audiences are based largely on assumptions that like social media is probably the spot. You want to connect with youth, go to social media, because that's what the story has been for like 2 decades, right? They don't usually have a whole lot of evidence to suggest why the platforms they choose are the best ones, but they just somehow know that that's where their audiences must be. So they feel this pressure to be there without actually even knowing for sure that there is a pressure to be there. They also feel like they need to go and be in these spaces for the public good, for the good of democracy, or at least for their professional career development. There's this sense that if you're not going to be on Twitter, at least pre-Musk, because things have changed, but when we were doing our interviews, there was this sense that you couldn't really do journalism and not be on Twitter because you weren't going to be taken seriously by other journalists. You weren't going to be noticed by the people who you needed noticed you. And public health communicators, particularly during the pandemic, expressed the same kind of thing, saying, well, if there are public discussions about hand washing, about mask wearing, about vaccination, like we need to go and be where those conversations are happening. Otherwise, we are not serving the public in the way we are supposed to as health communicators. So there's this intense pressure that these folks all put on themselves to be in these spaces, despite knowing that these spaces can be pretty hostile and scary. It's important to know, though, that it's not all bad. They don't all kind of think, oh God, I have to go and like deal with Twitter now. I have to go deal with whatever other social media platform they. Many of these public communicators see a lot of value. So this is a quote from a journalist that we interviewed. We interviewed her in 2019, so pre-pandemic time, pre-Musk. But she was talking about why she was on Twitter. And she was saying that she felt like this allowed her to have a personal brand that was separate from her employers. It made her feel like she had mobility within the workforce, and it made her feel like she could develop an audience that might follow her if she were to need to switch organizations and institutions. So that was empowering, even though she knew that it was potentially harmful. And she actually had been previously in the midst of an online firestorm where a whole bunch of people campaigned against her to throw just a ton of really negative stuff. And for her, she still saw some of the empowering parts of it. What's interesting is when we were talking to folks, both journalists and public health communicators, is that it's the early career and precarious workers who both feel most potential for empowerment and most fear of the attacks and like it is non-optional. More established folks, they're like, I can just leave. And more established folks often had organizations that backed them and said, either we're going to give you support or we no longer require you there. And so this is where we start to see some of the potential for identity characteristics come into play, right? We know that age often is related to early, whether you're early career or not. And we know that particularly in journalism in Canada, there has been a push recently to recognize that there's a whole lot of white men in political journalism, and maybe that's not a great thing for democracy, and maybe we need to have people who are not white men acting as journalists getting attention. And so there's been more non-white people and non-men being put into these kinds of roles, and then being in these positions where they might be at more risk, but also they feel compelled to be at more risk. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is this idea that the individual journalist is the one who's responsible for feeling like this. So I mentioned that some of the more established folks, they have access to an organization that supports them. But even in the biggest organizations, journalistic organizations in Canada, there's still relatively limited support available. One of the things we're working on doing, don't actually have paper yet on it, but we're working on trying to map out what those different journalistic organizations actually do offer as support. But what we found through our interviews with the journalists is that it was most often friends and family that were the main support network for folks. And when we talked to public health communicators, they often felt like they didn't have a social support network or a professional support network at all, and that their organizations were kind of scrambling up. In these kinds of situations, it is again the folks who are newest to the job, who are least supported by their organizations, who are most harmed by kinds of attacks and the extra labor of dealing with them. Even the labor of deciding whether or not something is something you need to worry about is a daily task for most people in these roles. So, the unique context of COVID-19 and public health communicators. This is where things differ a little bit between the journalists and the public health communicators in our studies. For the public health communicators, they were dealing with life and death situations, high stakes, high tension. We all remember what the first months of the pandemic were like. And suddenly there were these folks who were being thrust into the limelight, and they suddenly had this microphone and this access to audiences they did not have before, which also meant they suddenly had to deal with a whole lot of hate they never had to deal with before. The training that public health communicators typically get is science communication training. They're taught about how difficult it is to communicate complex health messages to the general public. And that was still true throughout the pandemic. They weren't taught about how to make sure that your particular post gets prioritized by an algorithm, or doesn't get shadow banned by an algorithm, or doesn't accidentally end up on the wrong side of TikTok, right? These are people who have not been trained, and they're thrown into this space that comes with its own baggage already, right? There were already anti-vaxxers on Twitter and Facebook and all of these other places well before the pandemic started. They knew how to use those platforms, and they knew how to mobilize and connect with each other. And the public health communicators didn't have the same experience with those platforms, which really set the stage for a lot of challenges for these people who suddenly had these really important informational messages they needed to get out to the public. So this is a thing that I'm still kind of thinking about right now. Brings me to the idea of, the influencer or creator tactics versus journalism and health communication tactics, the kinds of things that we train folks to do when they are influencers or creators, or the things they learn by doing that job, versus the things we train journalists and health communicators are pretty different. But when we're talking about existing on social media and surviving all of the harassment and hate, you kind of need to know those influencer and creator tactics to make it through. All right, next up, I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about the Mean Tweets Project more specifically. That's that one where we were looking at online harassment of political journalists during the federal election in Canada in 2019. We started with interviews. During those interviews, we introduced journalists to example tweets, and we got them to assess them for us and describe to us how they understood the negativity, how they might label it and categorize it themselves. And we asked them a bunch of other questions about their experience of harassment. And then we used those interviews to inform the development of a coding schedule so that we could do content analysis of the tweets we collected, mentioning them. We did a bunch of manual content analysis, about 5,000 or 6,000 tweets in total. And then we used those tweets to train a machine learning model to do some of that automated approach. So remember I said, you know, we're like mixed methods. Just because the automated approaches don't always get all of it right doesn't mean it's bad. Yeah, we were trying to figure out a way to do it better. So first off, this is a quote from a journalist who was talking about how she understands negativity and harassment online and how she kind of categorizes it in her mind. And here she talks about how, yeah, there's always going to be people unhappy. That's journalism. That's normal. That's fine. People can critique me. But when it starts to get hateful, that's when it gets concerning. This particular journalist is a Muslim woman who is brown and sometimes reports on race, so gets a lot of hate. And so for her, distinguishing between these things was very clear and very straightforward. And we saw that with most of the journalists we talked to. Most of the journalists we talked to helped us understand from their experience why it was really important to distinguish between different levels of negativity. The input from them about those attacks is really crucial because it's them who experience the harms. It's them who have to evaluate it on a day-to-day basis. So they're the best at evaluating it already because they do it all the time. They've got practice. And they're the ones who are going to use any of the tools or policies we develop to try and help it, right? So downsides, you have to do some smaller scale stuff when you're doing that kind of work because there's just too many people to talk to and not enough time. And it requires a lot of relationship building and trust because you want to go and talk to these often marginalized folks about something that is traumatizing in many cases. And so the relationship that you need to build takes time and care and attention. So we do this by doing the interviews where we get tweet categorization done, also through survey responses, and then this community of practice, which I mentioned earlier, where we do some participant action research. And that's the one where we're working with public health officials. So what we found when we did this analysis was we need a negativity scale. We really, really need to stop thinking about it as is it problematic content or is it not problematic content? Now, for those of you who are in this area, you will know that we often talk about, is it civil or uncivil? Is it hate or is it not hate? Is it harassment or is it not harassment, right? There's a bunch of different ways this is conceptualized and framed. And I like to use harassment and negativity as my words. In the Q&A, we can have a big old discussion about conceptualization if you want. There's lots to debate. But the key point that I want everyone to agree on, whichever concept you like, is binary approaches, just it either is or it isn't problematic, just do not cut it. And they do not cut it because journalists and political candidates and public health officials do not understand them as one or the other. They do not respond to them as one or the other. They respond to them and understand them based on a scale. So here's an example from low negativity. This might be something like, oh, you poor little misguided child. That was an actual tweet that was sent out. And when we put that in front of our journalists in interviews, they largely agreed that that's like pretty low negativity. Like, yeah, it's like, it's a problem. They're not being super respectful. Not a huge issue. And they said most of the time with low negativity, they just ignore it unless there's a lot of it. When it becomes a lot of it, when it becomes a campaign worth of it, that's when they start muting systematically. Anytime they see the same particular phrase, they just mute anyone who's using that phrase, for example. Medium negativity, this is more insulting. It is something that often requires the journalist to think a little more and do a little more emotional labor. Here, they are more likely to mute, but they're not even going to mute all of it because it's not necessarily going to be worth their time to do it. And then there's high negativity. And this is the category that most of us, I think about when we hear in the news about all of the vitriol that people are getting. These are hostile. This is where threats of violence might come in. And the responses here might be to block on Twitter, to report using Twitter, or to involve law enforcement when there was a sense that it was a legitimate threat. What I find really interesting here is that it's only at the high negativity stage that blocking or reporting on Twitter come into play. And that's because for a lot of journalists, they worry about the backlash if somebody figures out that they've done that, and they don't want to have to deal with a situation where they're being criticized for having stopped somebody from getting access to their information. And political candidates felt that even more intensely. I also think it's really interesting that this is the one we spend most time on when it isn't actually the one that journalists receive. Journalists actually talk much more about how tons and tons of low negativity stuff gets under their skin and is kind of annoying and is problematic, but it's harder to deal with. So we did that step. Then we went on to developing a machine learning model. I'm not going to get into all of the details of this right now, but the key highlights that you need to know are when we went to develop our model, we ended up having to combine medium and high together because there just weren't enough examples in our sample that we could reasonably code with a huge team of student labelers. And so we just had to kind of go with what we could do at the time, given our resources. And the other thing to notice here is the Cohen's kappa and the F1 scores are on the lower side. They're on the lower side because what we compare them to is typically binary models. It's a lot easier for a machine learning approach to guess A or B when the only options are A or B. But when you ask them to guess A, B, C, D, E, it makes it a lot more difficult. And it's also difficult because this is a complex topic and because coded racism and coded sexism are really hard to teach a computer to understand. They're really hard to teach humans to understand. So I'm going to give you some findings from this automated analysis, but we intentionally don't report things like statistical significance when we show these data because we don't want this to be taken as like generalizable, solid, concrete findings. Instead, we're using this to kind of paint a larger picture to get a general sense of the flows of negativity at different levels, okay? So this is a summary of negativity mentioning political journalists. About 18% of the tweets in our sample of 620,000 tweets had some level of negativity in them that we could identify. And we're pretty confident with this. This was actually the score that was highest when we checked for intercoder reliability. And so we're pretty solid on the fact that it is, just under 20%. Then we looked at the relationship between how much harassment and negativity folks get and how prominent they were on Twitter at the time. So this is looking at their follower count. And what you see in these 4 little Spearman correlation graphs here is for medium and high negativity in the top corner, you have a correlation of 0.512. Over to the side is low negativity, and you've got Spearman correlation of 0.205. Below is neutral, where there's almost no correlation whatsoever, which is what we would expect, right? Shouldn't really matter how many followers you have. Everybody gets probably the same amount of neutral. And then positive is actually a bit negative, suggesting that if you have fewer followers, you might actually get more positivity, which is an interesting finding. But it's the top two that I find most interesting and most useful for this conversation. And what I think is most relevant is the fact that that medium-high negativity, the stronger relationship than the low negativity, which can be interpreted as the more followers you have, the more likely you are to get those really mean, really hateful things, right? Fine, okay, not super surprising. I think what's more interesting is that there is a pretty substantial low negativity just across the board. It doesn't matter how popular you are, there's negativity that's coming at you. And this is where we get back to that idea of it affecting the jobs day to day of these journalists or public health communicators or candidates, right? There is this base level negativity that you open up your laptop, you're gonna face. Doesn't matter how popular you are or not, you're gonna get some of it. And that's a really difficult way to start off the day, because that means there's not really much you can do to prevent it as an individual. Now we have a table for negativity as it is related or not related to perceived gender and race. And here we see like almost no relationship whatsoever, which is exactly what the rest of the literature using these automated approaches tends to find. You'll see that there's a little bit of a relationship, it kind of looks like, for positive, but positive was the category for our model that we're least confident in. So worth further investigation, but not anything to write home about just yet. So this is interesting because even when we add our intensity level, we don't pick apart what's happening. The intensity level helped us pick apart what was happening with your follower count, with your prominence, not so much with race or gender. And that was a surprise to us because we were expecting that there would be a relationship here when we started to disentangle the levels of intensity. So, summarize this kind of portion here. Intensity matters. How journalists interpret this is in terms of low, medium, and high. They categorize tweets. They think about how they can batch different things. And they apply this to tweets, but they also in interviews talked about dealing with the same thing on TikTok, on Facebook, in their emails, which is actually where they got most of their online harassment. We'd miss trends if we weren't doing an intensity approach. For example, that idea of followers, everyone having a low level and the high followers getting more of the high and medium negativity. And it points to some complexities in what's going on that our binary measures just can't understand or are unintentionally masking. So to help it, the last thing here is I'll point out that this intensity matters idea also helps us deal with a common problem in machine learning ethics and the idea of dealing with bias. A lot of the common wisdom has been, if you just have more rows, the more evidence, more examples. If we had just coded more tweets, we would know what's happening. But in reality, coding more tweets and then still only having a yes, no, a binary option, we still would have missed things. And so what this shows us is we also need more columns in our data sets, not just those rows. All right, next key point, the target of the message matters. So I haven't really talked about this yet, but in all of our studies, we've been talking to these professionals to understand how they deal with messages that are clearly directed at them personally versus just negativity that's out there. And what we found is that it's really important to pay attention to that because depending on who the professional is, they interpreted targets differently. So there's a study that parallels the journalism study looking at political candidates, and we found in that comparison that there were key examples where something was very negative for a journalist and not so negative for a politician. So UDIPPER is the example I'll use here. In Canada, one of the political parties is the NDP. They're called dippers sometimes. Sometimes that's derogatory, sometimes it's not. If you call a journalist a dipper, you are suggesting that they have no journalistic ethics and they are just in the pocket of that political party. Whereas if you call somebody who is a member of the NDP a dipper, you are calling them a member of the party that they are in fact a member of. Very different in terms of whether or not that's coded as negative or not. If you were to call somebody from the Liberal Party a dipper, yeah, maybe that's meant as an insult, but that's probably a low-level insult, whereas you're not doing your job, you're partisan, you have no ethics, might be a medium or potentially high-level negativity. So here are a few examples of different tweets that journalists and politicians received. So Mercedes Global is a journalist for Global News in Canada. Justin Trudeau is the Prime Minister of Canada. And in that tweet, the first one there, very clear that despite technically this being a message at Mercedes, the hate is directed towards Justin, right? Then in the second one, we have Brian Lilly, who is a columnist, and Justin Trudeau, who is Prime Minister. And it's less clear who this is actually directed at. You need to go back and read the thread to understand who it was. And then the final one here, we have another example where it is a journalist and then a politician, and it's unclear exactly who the attack is directed towards. In our approach, what we learned we needed to do was actually create the threads as they existed on Twitter, recreate them in spreadsheets, and then we had our coders look through them to understand in more context who was actually the target of a message and who was being attacked. When we talked to journalists about receiving a bunch of hate that's actually meant for the politicians, they talked about how that creates an unsettled type of environment when they log into their Twitter account. They are constantly having to do the labor of figuring out, are you attacking me or is it somebody else? Can I immediately ignore this, or do I potentially need to deal with this in some way? And so even in the instances where it's not an attack on them, they still have to do labor to figure out what's going on. And two more examples here. We've got examples where Althea Raj, who was one of the debate moderators in the leaders' debate during that election, and had been photographed having dinner with Gerald Butts, who is one of the main, or was at that point, one of the main staffers for the Trudeau campaign. And she's being attacked here for being partisan in that first tweet. In the second tweet, a bunch of women journalists are all mentioned, and then Althea Raj is attacked for that dinner that she had. But it's actually a whole bunch of women journalists who are mentioned at the same time. And that's because they happened to be at the debate, doing debate coverage at the same time. But it's interesting to see that you would use the one instance of a woman journalist to then add all other women journalists that you can think of to a particular tweet. And that's something that's not uncommon, and that these journalists talked about, particularly women journalists, talked about happening fairly frequently. So the problematic content that isn't targeted ends up having slightly differing issues depending on which kind of actor we're talking about. For the public health communicators, they saw this kind of responsibility to provide high quality information. So the content that wasn't directed at them, that bothered them most, was information that contained mis and disinformation. They felt more easily able to ignore stuff that was directed at other people, but when it was mis and disinformation that they had just been tagged in, even if it wasn't about them specifically, they felt a need to respond or wanted some way to respond. For journalists, they often were able to be like, hey, if everybody disagrees, that's great. The problem is when, one political party really is on my team and all of the others aren't. And then this leads to questions about broader civil discourse, right? If you create a negative space that nobody wants to engage in, is that very good for democracy? Probably not. So the last chunk that I want to talk about is close readings and understanding political need. And I'm going to draw on the project on on health communicators, public health communicators, specifically officials. So Dr. Theresa Tam is the Chief Public Health Officer of Canada, and she was featured in a number of very terrible memes, and these are like the nicest ones I could find. And what this project showed was that when we start digging in beyond just the text, which is what most of the automated approaches that exist use, there's a lot of coded information in it, right? There is a lot about sexism and racism, and in the case of Theresa Tam, there was a lot of transphobia, intentionally using the wrong pronouns. That was all embedded in images, because those images could circumvent Twitter's rules for what content is and isn't allowed, and it would take longer to get taken down. What we saw in these was some kind of responses that were like, basically, I don't agree with the decisions you're making. And then other ones, like this second tweet here, where it is overtly racist, saying, you know, you should be deported back to China, which does not make sense because she's a Canadian citizen. And when we look at the kinds of harassment and hate and negativity that these folks received, these public health officials received way more than any of our journalists, way more negativity from the low level all the way up to the high level. Like 70% of the mentions of them were negative in some way. That's a lot to deal with for a bunch of folks who previously not a single Canadian knew their name. What's interesting when we do this deeper, closer reading, when we're reading into the images as well as the text, is that we can start to pull out the different kinds of attacks that happen. And what we see in this graph here is, 60% are these professional attacks, which again, we might expect should be a normal part of this job. But then when we get into things like identity attacks, which are things based on sex, gender, race, ethnicity, faith, etc., far fewer. The thing is, those fewer ones are often some of the most egregious. And I intentionally didn't show pictures of them because they're really horrible. But even a few really horrible things can make a really big difference in the ability of that health communicator to do their job. So the big thing that has come out of our interviews with public health communicators is that there is a need for support and training. And the big thing that came out of our close reading of the tweets mentioning public health communicators is we really need practitioner experience to inform how we understand this, because we didn't get to do a set of interviews specific to that analysis, and we need to. And so that's where that community of practice that Heidi Torek is heading up, and then I'll be part of, comes into play. So last bit here, just a little reminder on that methods front. The researcher perspective and methodological lessons we've got here, we really need to think about weighing consistency against speed, and speed rather against insight. A lot of the time we want to do the fastest approach, but this project took 6 years. 5 years of that involved individual students being trained how to read tweets, learning how to code them, analyzing them. Those 10 different students that worked with this project over that 5-year period, they had different gender, different racial, different religious backgrounds. They came from different experiences and brought those experiences to our code book. We ended up having to go through like 3 major redesigns of the code book. We interviewed before and after content analysis and had multiple different machine learning models developed over the process, because our goal was to try and do this as holistically as we could and with as much attention to the actual experiences of different folks as we possibly could embed, because we thought that that was more important than getting it out fast. It also means that, it's a 6-year project and I don't have a published peer-reviewed paper for you, but like working on it. So at the beginning, I said these were the 3 things I was hopefully going to convince you of. So online harassment does impact public health communicators and journalists' ability to do their daily jobs, particularly those who are early in their career, members of marginalized groups, they are the ones most affected. The intensity and type of negativity that they receive help us understand differences based on identity, and I think point to some methodological issues. For example, we did not come up with a good way to deal with the problem of trying to automate coded sexism, coded racism, or things that appear in images, and that's something that needs steps forward. And hopefully my very mixed methods approach convinces you that mixed methods is great and we should all be trying to combine these different perspectives as much as we can, resources permitting, in order to actually understand the experiences of these folks so that we can then have that research lead to better policy outcomes, better tech development, and better future research. So with that, I'll just do a little plug for the podcast once more. And then I will leave it out to you all for questions.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. Would love to dive into Q&A, and Daniel can help moderate a bit as we get going. We end up with a queue. We would like to. So I saw you first. Do you mind walking up to the mic so we can capture this better for later? Yeah. Do a tiny intro and bring your question on it.
Hi, I'm a fourth-year PhD student here at Huntsman and also working for CPAC this academic year as a graduate assistant. I really love your method. I'm really interested in methods for negativity online and online discourse as well. My first question is, you use 10 coders, and it's always what the most important issue when you're doing content analysis is getting like inter-rater reliability. And I want to hear more about how you did that when you have 10 different coders, and especially about like coding negativity. Is that, as I already mentioned, we'll have different opinions about what is high negativity, what is low negativity, and like having 10 coders coming in with different lived experience, I feel like there would have been lots of disagreements, and I wonder how you like resolve that on the way, and how whether you met inter-rater reliability or you use another method. And related to that, I was interested in knowing more about whether you looked into the other context on Twitter. So like said that even though some messages are low negativity, if they come into the feed frequently, it might have damage, like mental damage. And so did you look at the intersection of and negativity as well? And curious about whether even when it's like low negativity tweet, if it gets more shares or more likes, whether that matters. For example, if a high negativity tweet got like 0 likes versus if a low negativity tweet got like shared very widely, whether that matters.
Thank you. Those are really great questions. So I'll answer the second one first because it's a little quicker. We didn't look at the frequency and negativity related to each other. We do have the data for that, and I agree with you. I think it'd be interesting to look at. So it's kind of on the list, the long list of other things that would be great to do. The idea of, you know, how many favorites or tweets or quote tweets or whatever would be interesting, but the way we collected our data from Twitter makes that impossible. We used the streaming API very intentionally because we wanted to make sure that we were getting things as soon as they were posted, because we know that negativity is more likely than other content to get removed. But that means that when we collected content, it was before anybody had actually seen it, and so don't actually know how many favorites, et cetera, is. So on to the first question about inter-rater reliability and the 10 coders. So first off, I'll clarify, it wasn't 10 coder teams the entire time. What we did is we had phases of development for this codebook for this approach. So in the first phase, there were 3 different coders who helped me develop a very initial codebook that we applied to tweets that we collected actually back in 2017, so well before what the collection period for this study that I was talking about. And what we did is we used that example to develop a sense of what kinds of content are out there. So in that phase, we actually did a lot of bottom-up building. So we were reading the content and trying to categorize it in different ways. We were developing a sense of this intensity scale, but also another set of codes to look at types of negativity and created categorizations that later actually got used in that public health officials analysis. We were talking about, is this an attack on professional identity, attack on personal identity, et cetera. So that was the first phase with 3 coders. We used that to kind of have a baseline before we went into interviews with the journalists and before the candidates project went into interviews with candidates. So we had kind of a guess at that stage that intensity probably would matter, but we wanted to talk to them to figure it out. They did think intensity mattered. Then we revamped that initial code book. And here we had 4 different coders come on board and do analysis in the first stage of analyzing those 2019 tweets. Those 4 different coders, we had them paired up for the samples that they were analyzing, and we would rotate through who the pairs were. So they wouldn't always be working with the same other person, and not every single tweet was coded by all 4 people. So that helped with just managing it all and kind of balanced it against the risks of having this kind of groupthink style. And that approach helped, but of course we then had 2 people, and so if they didn't immediately agree, we had a conflict. What we did was we took an approach of getting them to have a conversation with each other about the disagreements rather than just immediately calculating intercoder reliability. And we did that because we know that personal experience has such an impact on how you understand what even is racism or sexism or whatever, right? And so we took this approach, borrowing from almost a discourse analysis kind of methodology, to make sure that we were kind of prioritizing, making sure we got the right signal out of all of this points. When there was a tie that just could not be broken, then either myself or Christine would come in and be the 3rd coder on that to break the tie. And then that is the final decision that we used to train the machine learning approach. And then we have intercoder reliability between that decision and what the machine said. So now I've explained how 7 of the coders came about. The other 3 came about because people graduate and no longer continue doing work, and we needed to do another round of content analysis because our machine learning model, it turned out, needed more data than we thought it needed originally. And so one of the coders from that original team of 4 was able to continue on. We had to bring 3 others on, train them up, spent a bunch of time making sure that all 4 of them were matching what the previous 4 had been doing, and then we just repeated that same cycle.
Would you mind so that we end up with the audio recorded? Is that okay?
That's fine. Yeah, so on slide 41, or I don't know if you want to go back to it, there was a really interesting breakdown of percentages of people that had received these different. Yeah, and I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about the overlap between those? I'm assuming they're not inclusive in that category. And then the other thing I'm just wondering is where did, okay, so with identity tax, did you have a separate code for explicit sexism and explicit racism versus you, woman, whatever, versus a more.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure we have.
Yeah. So this table comes from, so Michelle Hennessy, that master's graduate that worked on this project, she produced this table. And what you see here in that final column is the percentage of the negative tweets that were manually analyzed. What percentage of negative tweets had a professional attack or a personal attack, a threat and hostility, or identity attacks? a single tweet could have all of them. So when we were coding them, basically each of these things was yes, no as a code, and then we combined them to summarize in a single table.
Okay, so it was like a professional attack plus.
Exactly, yeah. And then in terms of implicit versus explicit sexism or whichever category you pick, we didn't treat them separately, we put them on it. Yeah, no problem.
Hi, Alice Marwick, CTAP. Thank you so much for this presentation. This was so interesting. So I have a question about Twitter, both in terms of the specificity of Twitter-based harassment and also the future of research on harassment since given the post-Musk Twitter world. So Twitter is interesting because I think it is where most of us see this kind of instability in a lot of ways. Like it's very visible, although for my own research on harassment, I know that people get harassed on a lot of other platforms, but it's not as visible to others, which may be more or less significant to the person, right? On the other hand, we've had, somewhat of a overemphasis on Twitter simply because it is so public and it's been so easy to collect data on. And we can see that Twitter use is starting to slow, and with Musk cutting the number of engineers and the amount of maintenance of the website, it's pretty likely it's not going to continue to hold this sort of central position in journalistic cultures that it has over the last decade. So I guess, how would you think about what happens if Twitter kind of goes away? We know that harassment isn't going to go away, but what happens if it's less visible, and how can we do research like this in a post-Twitter world?
Yeah, I mean, the post-Twitter world, we've been waiting for it for so long. Yeah, so when we first started this project, the idea behind using Twitter was this is where a lot of Canadian journalists are, and so it made sense as a site of research. They're still there a lot, but you're right, it's changing, and I think we should expect that things are going to look very different by the next election to understand harassment in election context, as we're trying to do. And then more broadly, I think that there are going to continue to be these types of harassment in private or quasi-private spaces. So email has always been a super big source of negativity for most of these journalists that we talk to. They talked about direct messages on Facebook or Instagram if they hadn't like intentionally blocked that capacity. And so those things, I think we can expect that that's probably going to go up. What I found through this study is that some of the most compelling evidence and most interesting things we found through our interviews and through our surveys. And we found that a lot of the automated analysis of the large scale stuff was not telling the full picture. And in some cases, like worse, it was obfuscating things and making the picture murkier and convincing policymakers that, oh, there's no issue because look, you yourself have data that suggests everyone gets the same negativity levels. And I'm like, that's not the story. So, I think it's going to need to change. I'm not necessarily concerned that we aren't going to be able to do as much of that big stuff that Twitter allowed us to do, because I don't know that it was necessarily serving us super well.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Chu. I work at the Center for Innovation, Sustainability, and Local Media here at IC. And I was just wondering, in your recruitment of journalists, how did you decide to do political journalists? And was everyone in the same media, or was there a difference among the media that people were in? Yeah. So I picked political journalists because I do political communication, like that's the actual answer. But then the election context made it make sense to do political journalists. I'll say though, there's a bit of an asterisk on that because most of the journalists we talk to wouldn't necessarily self-identify as like political journalists.
Most of them have had different beats over the course of their careers and will continue to have different beats. So I say political journalists. What I actually mean is journalists who at some point throughout the 3 months leading up to the 2019 federal election covered the campaign. And we had primarily print journalists, not intentionally, just because that's who happened to mostly have Twitter accounts. But we did have television and radio as well. And we used the Parliamentary Press Gallery as the initial kind of source to create our list, and then added on based on who was actually doing coverage.
My question. For other languages, English, and also.
For different languages. Yeah, so we initially collected tweets mentioning any journalists covering Canadian politics, which meant that there were journalists who were covering it in French, whose Twitter is primarily French. Ultimately, it was just too difficult for us to do the machine learning approach with that. And so we didn't do that step of it on any French language tweets. Journalists who report in French language, but their Twitter had a minimum of 5 English language mentions were still included. Our minimum of 5 mentions for the sample was just across the board, so that we didn't have like weird things in our results. And so that's kind of how the Me Tweets project dealt with French. We interviewed journalists in both official languages, although most journalists ended up being in English. It was their preference. And we haven't done a whole lot of work kind of working through what specific words to use, how you might need to conceptualize different things, but that is a huge kind of needed next step for a lot of this. As I'm sure many of you know, a lot of this kind of research has been done in English only, and a lot of harassment happens in a lot of different languages.
Don't have any questions coming in from online yet. So I'll say again, if anyone on the live stream would like to email ctap@unc.edu, we are monitoring that inbox for questions. But otherwise, would you like to say a final thank you and help us wrap up?
Thank you. That was awesome. I'm super excited about the work, and it's just tremendous in scope and scale, and also deeply important when it comes to basic questions about who can participate in voices. So I think doing this. With that, I think we can wrap up. Do you want to share details on the next one?
Yeah, I was gonna say, well, not necessarily full details, but yes, thank you for joining us for the start of our spring speaker series. The next event in the series will be not on a Thursday afternoon, but on a Friday morning. Join us on Friday, February 10th at 11 a.m. For a conversation on social media in the global South, moderated and together by our Nandita Narayana Murthy. So please come join us. We will have refreshments for you. We will have a live stream available for those who'd like to join us. Name Dr. Dubois once more for the 5 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thought about looking at 8:50.